So we've changed the running order slightly. So first we've got the Is It Digital AR Museum Narratives in Street Art from Valentina Vavassori. She's a PhD researcher at King's College London, studying digital approaches and contextual technologies in museums with a particular focus on chatbots and augmented reality. She's trained as an art historian and has an MA from the University of Milan, where she works as a curator, educator and research assistant across Italy and the UK. She's currently collaborating with the National Gallery in London and the Museum of London, researching social media. So if you want to take it away, Valentina.
So everyone, I will share my presentation. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So hi everyone. Today I will present part of my PhD thesis on augmented reality, museum narrative and street art, and in particular, what is the impact on the urban environment and on the urban heritage of the creation of an augmented reality layer. And so, I mean, first of all, the presence of the digital in heritage and in a museum environment is something that we have confronted in the last few months in particular. It's nothing new, but it's something that it's becoming as at the forefront of research and in general interest in the public. Situations such as Google Street View or Google Arts and Culture are becoming far more common, and people are checking online to see places and visit places. Of course, the digital and the relation between digital and place is really complex, because the digital have at the same time a nature of unplaceness, so it is something which is potentially accessible for everywhere, but at the same time, in particular with augmented reality, we are dealing with a concept of placeness of the digital. So we have an augmented reality layer on top of a physical place. And the idea of using the digital in the urban environment is deeply connected with the concept of opening up to new voices and new narratives within the urban environment. Then, if these voices are really new, it's up to discussion and how much this digital layer can be democratizing the urban environment and opening up to new narratives. But there's certainly the potential for create a digital museum within the urban environment. So, the creation of a digital museum and creation of a new augmented reality layer pose a few questions. First of all, how do visitors interact with these new technologies, such as augmented reality in an urban heritage setting? And secondly, what are the difficulties in introducing new narratives in an heritage context? So what happens when we are introducing new digital narratives? Are just digital, or they have an effect in the physical place? So to answer this research question, I've focused a particular case study, the Museum of Augmented Urban Art in Milan. The museum has actually multiple branches in various Italian cities, but I decided to focus on Milan simply because it was the oldest one available, the first one created. And the museum is a widespread museum, so the street art is not taken away from the context, but is left in situ. And also, it's a digital museum because it selects a set of street artworks in 5 peripheral neighborhoods in Milan, and these artworks are mapped with the collaboration of a set of local students and local schools. And the street art is also augmented by AR artists, which are different from the street artists, who comment and sometimes critique the street art. So what happened and how it is available? So there's nothing in the physical place which presents the existence of the street art. There's not a building. But when you open the app, you see a simple map, like in this case, this one. This is a screenshot, which presents the location of the various street art. And what happened? Well, when you come by nearby an artworks, like in this case, this is a street artworks by Secretive in Via Paolo Segneri, well, you simply use your camera, and there's an additional layer which opens up. But this additional layer creates a different kind of story or narratives of the artwork. For example, in this case, the representation of street art is simply the type of shop. It's an haberdasher shop. But when the AR is triggered, we see something different. because the street artwork becomes a love story. And there's this character was looking for his lover in the passerby cars, and this is suggested by the use of the word baciami, which means kiss me in Italian. So there's a new additional layer, a different story. However, the question is, how do we study something like this? How do we evaluate the impact, the effect on the visitors, and what kind of narratives are created through the augmented reality layer? Well, I interviewed 8 stakeholders, so I wasn't involved in the original project. I simply asked the museum, when they were open for around 1 year, 1 year and a half, if I could study their work. So I started interviewing people involved in the creation of the museum, in the creation of the digital and the physical place. And also I conducted interviews with visitors, starting from 39 surveys I collected on social media. So I was interested to see what was the final effect on the visitors. Also because the museum proposed different kind of activities with the urban heritage. There are individual visits, but there are also organized tours and experience. And so, what kind of narratives have been created in the urban environment? Well, first of all, the augmented reality has a first effect on the visitors. It declares the street art as an artwork. So people isolate street art and they start thinking of street art not as a background of the urban environment, but as a fundamental part, as an artwork, as something related to art history or to heritage. For example, one of the visitors commented and said, there are images which are, say some cases, in a little corner of a wall which in the meantime has been tagged by a lot of people. So that particular work is not noticed because it is surrounded by a mess. So the AR takes the artwork physically out from the context. Of course, this isolating, this tunneling effect of the augmented reality, which is something that has been noticed in various papers, for example, on memory and the use of augmented reality in education, has some unexpected effect of the experience of street art in the urban environment, because street art is, in particular in Milan, born out of in-between places within the urban environment, train tracks, streets, and these places are usually, and the street art in these places is usually based on an idea of invisibility and visibility. So if you are interested in street art, you go and look for it, but it's not something that everyone notices. And it's has been called from some researchers the hide and seek game of street art, this invisible layer of visible and invisible layer of the city. And of course, using augmented reality, this layer changes because the street art is present is as part of an art historical broader narrative of the city. There's a second effect of the augmented reality, which is that visitors started seeing the urban environment in a different way. And they started visiting different parts of the urban environment. So, for example, visitors reported to visit parts of Milan they've never seen before. So usually visitors went and, for example, in tours, and they started looking for some neighborhoods, and they experienced the app and the street art, they did some guided tour, but then they also started visiting different places, and they also reported the intention to visit with new eyes their neighborhoods looking for street art. So I had visitors who realized there was street art nearby their own home, and they started looking for it and seeing in different ways. So this is particularly important if we think that in Milan, most of the cultural experiences are localized in the city center. So visitors perceived as important the idea that in different neighborhoods, in the place they live, there's a new kind of narrative and identity which is recognized by a different museum. And so, for example, this new identity changes the idea of this neighborhood as dangerous. For example, one of the visitors told me, some artworks which are mapped are nearby my house, and they are in a place that, if you speak with a Milanese, the answer is no, I'll never go there, even if indeed nothing happens. So there's a change, and there's also a connection with street art and identity, and this positive idea that you can visit and go and experience the urban heritage in different places than the usual one, than the traditional one. Of course, this going beyond the traditional is also associated with a different narratives, with the concept of street artness. Street artness has been defined as Andron as this connection of ideas as edginess, innovativeness, and alternativeness associated with street art. They're also associated with the idea of authenticity. So visiting places which are authentic, we are not touristic. This is particularly problematic, however, if it's connected with the use of new digital technologies, because the digital technologies are perceived as innovative. So the audience tend to identify this innovation of the technologies and the innovation of this street artness narrative with the subsequent risk, for example, related to gentrification and changes in the urban environment. So it's a long discourse, but there's definitely this risk of this vision of there's definitely a risk in changing the urban environments with this kind of narrative. And then there's another risk, because of course, as I said before, augmented reality tend to isolate certain street artworks. So this is particularly risky if we think that this museum has been developed in partnership with other official city institutions. So, and then because not everything is mapped, there are some artworks we are considered as authorized and some artworks we are considered as unauthorized. So what happens is that there is a canon of authorized street art within the city. And there's also an additional risk because using augmented reality, there's a risk of creating an unauthorized memory of street art. Because the museum decided not to cancel the augmented reality when the street art artwork is not available anymore. Because of course, street art has a tendency to be ephemeral. So street artworks may disappear over time, and conserving conserving and making available the augmented reality layer, even if the street art disappear, means conserving and creating an authorized memory of street art of the city and selecting a certain level of the palimpsest of the urban environment. So to conclude, the digital is certainly a potential agent of change, so it can act as narrative stipulator, as creator of new narratives. It can also introduce new voices, but it's up to discussion because, of course, we are not working in a neutral environment, but there are power relationships and different authorities and different voices in the environment. The digital this particular case study, and in particular use of augmented reality, confront with the problem of digital unplacedness and placedness. Because at the same time, the experience is unplaced, because you can experience the augmented reality layer potentially everywhere, but it's also placed in a new kind of sense, because the digital sometimes influence the physical environment. And that happened in particular in one case, in the case of these artworks, which is Cucci Milano by Z1. And what happened was that in 2018, there was a proposal to expand the advertisement space within the artwork. The proposal was stopped, because the change of the advertisement, the expansion of advertisement by 10 centimeters would have mean that the augmented reality layer would not be available. So, and at the end of the day, the conservation of the artworks was guaranteed by the digital layer. So, at the end of the day, the digital is not so unplaced and so unphysical as expected. So, to conclude and to go back to my original question, is it just digital? Well, no, it's not. It has a long-term effect on the urban environment, on their conservation, and on their urban heritage. So, thank you for listening. These are my contacts, so if you have additional questions to ask me, you know where to find me. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, that was really great. We've got a question in the chat from Ben. If you want to read it out, you can do.
Coming. Okay.
Brilliant. Hi, Valentina. Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Charlotte. So I was just wondering, I might have missed it at the start, but are these artworks primarily AR artists who are kind of putting the AR stuff on top of existing street art? or is it that you're getting street artists and AR artists working together in the first place to create something brand new?
Okay, yes. Originally, what happened was that the street art and the AR was created by different artists. So that was the first step of the project. And in some cases, there were some sort of collaboration, but it was really rare, simply because at the start, the project didn't start with this idea. They realized over time that they needed to collaborate more with street artists. And then in the new versions they're doing now, in the new projects they're doing, in that case, there's more of a collaboration. So even street artists are involved, for example, in workshop with AR artists, and they are creating more synergic kind of artworks.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I was just wondering if a street artist had created a piece of art somewhere, and then an AR artist comes along and changes it, what does that mean in terms, not only from the artwork's point of view, but copyright and all that sort of thing? Does that even apply? I have no idea.
Yeah, it's a complex situation in copyright spaces, because also in Italy, the landscape law, so the idea that or the panorama law, as you want to call it, is particularly strict. So there is a lot of discussion about, for example, if creating augmented reality digital layers has some effect in copyright term. And this is something that we'll probably confront in the next few years, because there's a lot of experience in, for example, museums and creating augmented reality layer within museums by third-party apps, and what will happen in that case in terms both of copyright and in terms of effect on the audience, for example. I'm thinking of the MoMA, for example, or Hacking in the Eyes as the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about it right now.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Welcome.
I actually had a question as well. Do you think the pandemic has made a difference in the amount of people that are interested in augmented reality?
I think it will be something that we will see in the next few years, probably, because I mean, the problem with augmented reality right now is I think it's more a technological problem than the rest. I mean, what will happen when we'll have augmented reality not only when we are at home, but when we are outside. So definitely the pandemic has underlined the problem of what will happen next. And also if you can use augmented reality inside our home. So it's a lot of ongoing things about these digital layers and what will happen after. And I think also people are interested because, of course, experience like, which are not augmented reality, but experience like the street view are taking into consideration what these kind of new virtual reality or augmented reality interactions.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I can't see any more questions or hands up in the chat. If anyone wants to jump in now before we move on. If not, I believe we've got Akash's PowerPoint sorted. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm just going to share it. 2 seconds.
So the next talk is titled Heritage, Urbanity, Thinking Through Bihar. Akash Bharadwaj is a PhD candidate at the Department of History at Shiv University in India. His PhD project, Collections Museum Heritage, explores and interrogates the way by which objects, histories of collections, and exhibitionary practices create and build a notion of regional space, identity, and cultures in Bihar. He's also working on a photo book project documenting the colonial and pre-colonial structures of old Patna city. So if you're ready, Akash.
Thanks a lot. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Sutton, Rihanna Price, and everyone involved in organizing this workshop. And I have actually been thinking about this topic for quite some time now. It's actually this workshop that I have been able to put together my thoughts on paper. So before I begin my paper, let me first state the brief scope of this paper. Bihar, considered as one of the most underdeveloped states in India, occupies a prominent place in the national historiography. In the 19th and 20th centuries, The conception of an ancient Mughal empire and a Buddhist heritage consolidated the provincial and national identity of Bihar. Today, the meaning of heritage has become more plural. The proliferation of digital technologies has made past a category accessible to a wide range of people with multiple possibilities. In this paper, I focus on two young photographers based in the city of Patna, Bihar's capital, their photographic practices, and the emerging visual culture on social media to show that the contemporary creation of heritage is linked to both a foregone provincial past and an imminent urban future. I further situate this predicament by selecting a group of their images, analyzing their socio-aesthetic lives, and placing them in the contemporary discourse around the emergence of regional and urban identities of the state of Bihar. So, to begin, next slide, please. Next slide. In September 2019, the heavy rain flooded the streets of Patna, the capital of Bihar, in eastern India. For a state prone to recurrent floods and known for its backwardness and lack of public infrastructure, the news was received in national and regional media with much apathy and casual remarks in the state's sad affairs. Amidst this furor and media headlines, a young photographer based in the city did a photo shoot that showed a young woman, a student at the city's fashion institute, donning a bright red dress and posing in the flooded water in a cheerful mood. The image posted on Instagram began circulating and immediately went viral on social media and the internet. With time, it also began to elicit different reactions. While for some it was an insensitive image to represent the state's plight, for the photographer, Saurabh Anuraj, the photo shoot attempted to capture both the city's plight and to situate how residents like him were coping and encountering the situation. Next slide, please. As he narrated in an interview with a local news agency, the idea of a photo shoot came to him as a concept in the morning when he called his friends, and right after, he began the photo shoot with a camera in his hand. The virality or the popularity of an image can be seen as linked to various factors, a kind of shock, a sudden unexpectedness, or simply a delight an image can offer at the level of form and aesthetics. I would suggest that Anuraj's image titled Mermaid in Disaster is a combination of all these factors, and at the same time, it is also symptomatic of issues of urbanity, development, and identity of the state. While on one hand, it indicates an emergent subjectivity of urban middle-class youth, on the other hand, it is also about placing in the dominant discourse of backwardness an image of glamour and urban future, indicative of a new Bihar. Next slide, please. The discourse on new Bihar can also be traced to a change in the political regime in 2005, when the present chief minister came into power, following the plank of urbanization and good governance. Since then, the state, especially its capital Patna, has witnessed several infrastructural projects, including monumental heritage structures, despite its poor performance on basic human development indicators of education, health, and employment. Next slide, please. The predicament of this new Bihar architecture can also be gleaned through the newly built Bihar Museum, a mega project built at the cost of 600 crores in the city's heart to showcase the heritage and modern identity of Bihar. At the museum center stands a monumental installation titled Yantra by Subodh Gupta, a contemporary artist from Bihar. Next slide, please. According to Gupta, the installation's inspiration, next slide, please. Installation's inspiration came from Rangoli, a folk art representing a circular decorative pattern or design he saw in practice during his childhood. Next slide. The rendition of a folk motif into this monumental installation in Gupta's well-famous signature style, I suggest, reveals a moment whereby the shiny appearance of stainless steel evokes both nostalgia and emptiness about a provincial past. Nevertheless, at its surface, it promises a new urban future. So this trend of assembling icons that accommodate both a foregone provincial past and at the same time hold a promise for a new urban future is what I term as heritage urbanity. I elucidate further on this theme in the paper by focusing on two young photographers, who actively utilize many natural and cultural heritage structures, including rivers, monuments, and so on, that not only depict a provincial past of the state, but also showcase an urban future by placing it in a discursive framework around the identity of the state. I divide the rest of the paper into three narrative themes and combining a short biography of the two photographers, Saurabh Anraj and Ashish Kaushik, their photographic practices, and through an analysis of the ways by which these images are produced and circulated, I think through both on the concept of heritage urbanity and regional identity of the state. So the first theme is migratory life world, a movement between places. Next slide, please. Both Saurabh Anraj and Ashish Kaushik were born in the late 90s in the state of Bihar and grew up in a provincial atmosphere where they were expected to choose either medicine, engineering, or civil services as their profession, the traditional choices that are considered as the source of mobility and status in the state. However, while Saurabh went to an engineering college in the neighboring state of Jharkhand, which he later left, Kaushik decided to pursue a diploma course in mass communication from an institute in Noida in the national capital region, near Delhi. Arvind Das, a historian of Bihar, in his article, India in the Image of Bihar, published in the late 90s, commented on the mass exodus of workers and students from Bihar to metropolitan cities of Bombay and Delhi, and wondered if the migrants will ever return, given the atrophied nature of governance in the state. And even if they did, what course will it follow? I suggest that this is perhaps an apt time to revisit Das's argument. In this presentation, the two photographers I discussed did come back to Bihar and are making significant contributions to the state's public culture and identity. I have chosen these two photographers who, despite being a small number, garner the most number of followers and likes and have been recognized both by state institutions and magazines like Times, Outlook, and so on. Moreover, and therefore, they also assert a significant presence among youth, especially from Bihar. Both Saurabh and Kaushik have established their private studios sometime around 2018, namely Meow Studio and The Undiscovered. And they take up projects with state government, corporate, and private assignments, and also take private assignments. Next slide, please. From showing the glittering city's glittering lights, identifying many new natural and cultural heritage sites, and also showcasing the potential aspects of tourism in the state, their works, I would suggest, attempt to let go of the provincial image of Bihar. Kaushik makes the intent clear in an interview. Next slide, please. Quote, once a friend asked me to search Bihar on the internet, and I was startled to find the images of poverty and backwardness. It is when I started to interrogate the negative identity of the state, unquote. Having studied and lived outside the state for many years, the discursive framework of a place and its association with their own life gives the two photographers I discussed here perhaps a reason and a purpose to reflect both on the place they come from and their own identity. Next slide, please. However, as one goes through their Instagram profiles, where they also post many of their official works, these images' characteristic feature is their smoothness. Beyond their aesthetic effects, they reflect a social imperative of positivity, a signature of present times, as discussed by Boin Chal Han in the context of contemporary art. The composition of these images does not reflect any irregularity, conflict, injury, or resistance. What it looks for are the likes and shares. As a result, they also invisibilize the life world of workers and communities who sustain these places. They are instead relegated to the past, to oblivion, and what gets mobilized in the place are the landscape sceneries, monuments, and heritage structures on a monumental scale placed adjacent to new urban materials, bridges, automobiles, and dams. Next slide, please. The second theme that I discuss here is historiographic transitions and Bihar's regional identity. In the last decade, the proliferation of digital technologies and their accessibility to a broad group of people has made the site of heritage more active and dynamic. While there have been many different themes from food to monuments and other popular cultural practices that have come under the rubric of heritage creation, much like the earlier times, they still get associated with a larger discursive frame of national and regional identity. However, as compared to the 19th century and 19th and 20th centuries, when the conception of an ancient Magadh empire and Patliputra loomed large over the historiographic tradition, in recent years, And especially in the work of these photographers, the category of heritage has become more dispersed, and there seems to be a stronger emphasis on the regional identity. Next slide, please. As Kaushik points out, earlier the government and other public and private agencies mainly focused on places like Bodh Gaya and Nalanda as active sites of heritage. But now we know that there are many more sites to be explored and created. A significant amount of Kaushik's work is concentrated in Rohtas and Kaimur, which are not very significantly placed in the historiographic tradition, but in recent times are acquiring tremendous traction for travel and tourism. Kaushik had discovered and brought on maps many natural and cultural heritage structures, including waterfalls, forts. His work on Rohtaskar Fort, where Adivasi or Munda from all over the country congregate to celebrate their roots and ancestry, according to him, has drastically increased the number of visitors who visit the fort, who have visited the fort in recent years. Next slide, please. Also, unlike the dominant modality of survey, where there is a strong emphasis on historical accuracy and dynastic records of heritage structures, these photographers emphasize heritage creation through an immersive and performative experience. The use of drone cameras, slow motion, time lapse are intertwined with hashtags such as adventure, tourism, Chalo Bihar Ghumte Hain, let us explore Bihar, to name a few. And in that sense, they differ significantly from the earlier heritage discourse, which has chiefly been pedagogic. In the performative realm, heritage creation in contemporary times is also working with old popular forms in innovative ways. Next slide, please. For instance, in 2018, Kaushik Studio ventured to do a calendar project. Next slide. Whereby they documented 12 sites of Bihar and sold over 2,000 copies worldwide, including in the Bihari diaspora. Similarly, in many of his projects, Saurav Anuraj utilizes many heritage sites which offer scale and scenic beauty for wedding photography and corporate shoots. Thus, unlike the dominant mode, next slide please, where chronology and a linear conception of heritage and ancient past remain a prominent feature, what we observe in the works of these photographers on social media is a dynamic association of heritage with performance, experience, business, and commerce, and sheer diversity of places and identities. The last thing that I want to talk about is culture as industry, industry as culture. The lack of industrialization and poor performance on fundamental human development indicators have been significant issues that Bihar's development discourse has contended since post-independence. In the late 90s, Arvind Das wrote how Bihar's modern economy mostly survives on traditional sectors of education, medicine, and government jobs. Next slide, please. Scholars have attributed the lack of private initiatives to the state feudal character and a centralized economy. As a result, despite being a state with considerable mineral resources until 2000, when Jharkhand became a separate state and minerals went there, Bihar still continues to be tagged as a Bimaru state, sick state. In the recent years, however, especially after 2005, with the new government and its focus on a good governance model, there has been a considerable increase in its GDP growth rate. However, many scholars have argued that this growth is primarily a result of government's investment in construction and services. In a significant way, this story is not reflective of the growth in the manufacturing sector, which according to them, generally forms the backbone of an economy. In this connection, I want to suggest that the new urbanity, which appears to be full of futuristic possibility, still stands on a very fragile ground. One can also notice a shift in here, whereby the thrust on manufacturing has been relegated to a model of entrepreneurism and creative industry. Next slide, please. In this context, for many Tier 2 cities like Patna, heritage urbanity has become an essential model for growth, development, and building up of regional identity. In the year 2019, the government prepared a dossier to claim for Patna the status of a heritage city after Ahmedabad and Jaipur. Though Patna has not been able to get that status as yet, the government's considerable investment in creating an infrastructure for cultural industry, whereby the raw agricultural land, natural sceneries, and rich archaeological remains, antiquities, and monuments are being assembled together to form a trajectory for urban growth and development. Next slide, please. For the two photographers I discussed in this presentation, a small device like that of a camera is part of this new creative industry that sustains both their careers and acts as the driving force for this form of heritage urbanity. Much like the picturesque and sublime paintings of the 18th century, these images render provincial past with futuristic possibilities. However, what it also contains is the packaging of culture and heritage on a global stage. While it is difficult to explicate this process at this initial stage and something that I don't go into, but there is a high probability that this will contribute a process of gentrification in a sense that these sort of images will sort of set the state and capital a way open to enter. And it will contribute to gentrification, and that it will be challenging for this urban renewal to accommodate the massive force of informal and unskilled labor. So by way of concluding, by situating the two photographers in the socio-political environment, looking at image production practices and analyzing their images' socio-aesthetic lives, I've shown how heritage as a category is offering spaces for new urban imagery and building up of regional identity. While this process marks a phase of transition in terms of how heritage has been understood historiographically, it also seems to have great implications for urban life. On one hand, it does indicate a move towards democratization in the sense that it seems to be offering agency for entrepreneurial growth for creative and cultural industry. There is also a high probability that it will lead to a kind of gentrification that we see in cities now in terms of gated societies and enclaves of growth and development. Whereby a substantial share of this growth will be appropriated and consumed by a middle class on the back of global capital. However, how this process will unfold needs to be investigated with much more detail and regional emphasis. Next slide, please. I think this is a video, but this won't work. Is this working? So yeah, I think because we changed the format, video cannot be played now. But it was just a short video that sort of, it was based on the calendar project that Ashish Kaushik did, and it sort of because of the week, it sort of summarizes what I've discussed just now. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting and some beautiful photos as well. Debs, do you want to start off the questions with the one on the chat?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll put my hand down. I had another question I think I wanted to ask more, which I was just typing out. Akash, thank you for a really fascinating and thought-provoking paper. I wondered if you could say more about the relationship between the kind of aestheticization of these sites, the proliferation of really beautiful images of heritage sites and their gentrification. And I think what I was thinking about is an example from Delhi, not Patna, which I don't know at all. But I was thinking about this nursery restoration, which is beautiful. It's a jaw drop, but that aestheticization has also led to far stricter policing of that space by visitors. So it's very different to visit Sundar Nursery than it is, I don't know, Lodi Gardens, where people can lie around and there can be interaction with kind of plant life, and it's very much a space of leisure. Whereas Sundar Nursery, if you go anywhere near the fountains, a chowkidar will sort of tap you on the shoulder with a stick and tell you to stay away. And I wondered if there's images of heritage that circulate on social media, and also a kind of reified version of these heritage sites as spaces, as material spaces, and what's expected and allowable by visitors when they go there. So that was very long-winded, but yeah, your thoughts are very welcome.
Yes, right. But I do, like, even if you take Buddha Smriti Park that you mentioned, it's interesting because while there's no one response, like I have had interaction with people, while on one hand it does seem to offer a space, in a congested city like Patna, where you have a park, and people do have this aspiration for a certain kind of urbanity, and in that sense I mean people from across classes. So that is there, but on the other hand, you do see in the same discourse, you also find that there are people who are raising questions like, had you established a factory, it would have given us employment. So I think in that sense, there is a very interesting sort of trajectory that opens up, because on one hand, while these places, though it's spread over a large area, but what it does is that in terms of providing employment or providing, that on that note, it fails completely, because and the kind of employment opportunities that it also offers is a kind of a class of people who are, sort of English speaking, or who at least know how to maneuver these sort of, urban sort of modern spaces. But for a large number of people who are not suited to this kind of environment, for them it doesn't work that well. But then again, I would also say that but there is a very complicated process at work here, because there are people, you see people from all across sections visiting the park. And something that I have been thinking about, I've not been able to do it in detail. For example, even the places that I talk about, I think that one really needs to sort of engage ethnographically with some of these places and see that, how it's sort of unfolding on the ground. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Rihanna, do you want to go next with your question from the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. So I was just wondering, how important is a site like Instagram in this kind of creation and curation of urban cultural heritage? So obviously you've talked about those two photographers, and Instagram is the platform they use. So do you think it's really important, I suppose?
Yes, I do think it's important, because right now you see, almost everyone has access to mobile phones, and especially youth, they do have access to it and they utilize it very frequently. And if you look at, I have mentioned only two photographers, but if you look at Instagram, there are hundreds of handles with, like Bihar Explore, Bihar, Hum Bihar se hain, we are from Bihar. So that's something which sort of, and the name is also particularly kept as such, something that has to do with Bihar. And it's not only and it's also that's what I wanted to bring forth in my paper, that it's happening, what is happening on Instagram on a digital space is not exactly sort of very different from what is happening on other spaces, like non-digital spaces. So for example, if you see that there are a number of restaurants that have come up in the city in recent years, and at the same time, you see a number of food bloggers who are active on Instagram, sort of promote, they make short videos, so it's in very interesting ways, this sort of local cuisines and branding and market, all of these things sort of come together to create not only a market space for market, but also a kind of regional identity and so on. So, and there are a large number of people who are sort of using Instagram. Yeah.
Thank you.
We've had another question in the chat. Sudeshna, would you like to read it out?
Yeah, hi Akash. Thanks a lot. I have, just to be very absolutely transparent, Akash is my PhD student. But I just wanted to know, Akash, one thing. In India, we talk in terms, you talk about digital heritage. Now, and as you said, as somebody asked this question about Instagram, there is this whole digital world which is becoming so big and powerful. On the other hand, when we think in terms of heritage, or one talks in terms of heritage in that country, it is still the notion of old traditions, old culture, etc. So, so the point is that even though one is, academics talk about digital heritage, my question to you was, if you just use this name and you throw it out at the local people, for example, those who come to the museum, for example, and they see Subodh Gupta's yantra or whatever, do they have any idea that there is something called a digital heritage which has been kind of made into an academic format in that country?
No,
including the photographers, including your photographers. And I bring in here Chris Penny's work, and I mean, there's this whole thing about digital, but I wonder what people think.
right. I agree to that. Actually, especially like if you talk about people, local people, that they wouldn't identify with themselves with this category of digital heritage, or this notion. I suppose this would be very foreign to them. But at the same time, what I find interesting is this, though they are not very familiar with the category, the use of mobile phones, and so for example, I just browse on YouTube and find a number of people from different spaces, from different small districts, who are going to different places and making videos out of that. So that there is a certain fascination with the digital that I see, and in that sense, I do feel that it has opened up a certain possibilities. Though what this means is, I'm not very sure about that. Like, even though I say that it's certain democratic possibility, but I think it's too early to say that. And these photographers also, I think that when they began working, they did not have this notion of digital heritage, as far as I can understand. What happened was, I think that because they are also of my age group, so I can identify in that sense that as you as you grow up, there is this big proliferation of digital technology and a camera you have, and you don't, before you think of these things, you just start practicing, at least in case of these photographers, and then they start like sort of doing work. And even though they don't identify themselves with this notion of digital heritage, they are somehow like working in that direction. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And we've had another question from Ansi. I hope I pronounced that right. If you want to read it out, or I can.
Yeah. Hi. Hi. Lovely paper, Akash. So yeah, regarding the Bihar Museum Denali that was recently organized, if you want to talk a bit more on it, like the relationship between the museum and the digital heritage. And it was organized on a large scale with so many events. So yeah, if you want to talk about it, yeah.
Right. So in terms of Bihar Museum, obviously it sort of fits into this narrative that I talked about. And even if you look at the museum in a place like Bihar, the way the display has been organized in the museum is very, like, while on one hand there is a very strong emphasis on antiquities and this notion of chronological sense of history, but at the same time you also see use of multimedia and newer ways of displaying sort of artifacts and objects. And about the museum Biennale that was organized, yes, and in that sense, what is happening here is that in terms of like the photographers I discussed here, or even what is happening in what can be considered as civil society, it goes hand in hand with how sort of state is thinking. So in that sense, I don't see a very strong divergence between state and people. So both of them seem to be working on this together. And in that sense, what a point that even this museum Biennale, a point that I haven't explored in the paper much, but I think what is important is that how sort of art and culture are becoming this driving force for urbanization in today's time. So you see a number of, organizations, you see a number of startups coming up, which are sort of using this narrative or the trope of organicity or art and culture to actually work to create a market for that. So in that sense, Bihar Museum Biennale, also the museum project, I think in the longer run, there is this idea whereby, because Bihar does not have many industries, and I think it's also very unlikely that there will be that kind of, conventional industry. So I think this art and culture becomes a very important entry point. At least it's seemingly so. It's appearing like that in case of the government to do these kind of projects. And it's not only about market, it's also about creating this notion of good governance or creating a regional identity, because everything in some ways is very linked together. Yeah.
Thank you for that paper, Akash. It was really interesting. And if there's any more questions, we'll have time for discussion at the end of all the papers. So if it's okay, we'll move on next to Serafeim Alvanides, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, with a paper titled Spatial Digital Humanities, an Alternative Appraisal of Postwar City Transformation, which is co-authored with Carol Ludwig, who can't be with us today. But Serafeim is a social geographer with expertise in quantitative methods and GIS. His research and teaching interests involve the analysis of large spatial data relating to urban sprawl, active transport, and linguistic landscapes. And the question driving his research is to what extent the environment influences individual behaviours and outcomes. And he's also the co-editor for the International Journal of Environmental and Planning, Urban Analytics and City Science. So if you're ready, Serafeim.
I am ready, thank you. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction. I take it I will speak for around 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction, and thanks also for inviting us to give this talk. Unfortunately, Carol Ludwig, my colleague, could not make it today, so I will deliver on her behalf. And as you kindly introduced me, I'm a social geographer, and she's an urban planner. And this is a project or a sub-project from a larger consortium called Urban Meta Mapping, which consists of 4 universities and research centers in Germany and 1 in Austria, and looking at various cities in relation to bombing and post-war city transformations. Now, why are we interested in this kind of work for the urban meta mapping, as we call it? Well, I'm going to give you first a little bit of an oversight of what this project is about overall, and then I will focus on what the aims are for the specific sub-project, and then I will give you an example in the city of Essen in Germany. So this study brings together heterogeneous and under-researched data sets, maps, and archival material from the period from around 1939 to 49. This is the overall project. And you can see here the case study cities across Europe. Unfortunately, they're not very clear, but ours are a little bit lighter. You can see there Nuremberg, in Köln, Essen, Duisburg, and Poznan in Poland. And as you can see, it's quite a few cities that we are looking at, and for quite a long period. And the reason why we're focusing on this is that historical maps have traditionally been taken at face value. And in particular, the maps we are interested in, the distraction maps of these cities, have been interpreted mostly as a representation of reality, of what happened on the ground. But what we realized by looking at these maps and how they changed over time is that they have been used in many different ways and revisited and reinterpreted. And I will show you examples of these maps very soon in my presentation. the kind of research area we're interested in is, on the one hand, the urban form of cities, how this urban form changes. So this is very much a planning kind of aspect. The socioeconomic structure of cities and how this is changing over time. And this is a social geography aspect, as well as the representation of the city over time in maps. And this is the critical cartography type of approach that this project is involved in. So there has been some recent research linking the urban form of cities with the socioeconomics. The urban form and the socioeconomics has been linked in more recent years, but the urban form of the past and how this changed with the socioeconomics of cities today is a more recent area of research. And the realization from Venerandi and colleagues is that the kind of problems that some of the cities experience in terms of deprivation and high densities, for example, are not necessarily the legacy of the war years per se, but are also the result of decisions, planning decisions concerning the urban form. And these decisions over time, taken by authorities, planners, etc., can explain up to 70% of the differences in deprivation today in certain cities. So this is the kind of area we're interested in. We're trying to understand to what extent these changes in urban form for the selected cities had an effect in the socioeconomic structure of these cities. Now, Germany is a particularly interesting case, of course, as many of you will know. After the war, or during the war, there were 2.5 million homes destroyed in Germany and 4 million irreparably damaged. That makes it 6.5 million homes in the country, and 11.5 million people were displaced as a result of the war and population exchanges and movements. You can see on the left-hand side what Nuremberg looked like after the bombings. This, of course, created a number of issues and also opportunities for comprehensive planning. So on the one hand, we had the homeless people that needed to be housed, and on the other hand, we had these kind of competing visions of how the city should be developed further. So here are some examples of these maps that I was talking about earlier in terms of how much distraction has happened in a part of Nuremberg. And you can see here that the interesting perspective from cartography is that they are depicted with different colors, at different scales, with different details, and this changes, although it's kind of roughly the same period. You can see there that the maps are from 1944, 1945, 46 at the latest. And as time goes by, certain areas have been classified and reclassified as completely destroyed or semi-destroyed, or the legends have slightly changed, etc. So the overall project is asking this very important question: to what extent did these maps become instruments of transformation rather than simply depicting the destruction on the ground? And then also from a planning perspective, what can we understand by looking at these maps and these associated documents about planning decisions taken for these cities? And you can see here on the right-hand side, the planning, the plans for rebuilding, which are these red buildings there. And you can see very easily how they differ from the past. Now, moving on a little bit to the socioeconomic aspect of this research. As I said earlier, the most important issue was to rehouse the population very quickly. There were diseases around, people were dying in the streets, and they had to be somehow rehoused within a few years. So what we see here at the bottom right is very quickly put together housing, which looks quite nice actually, but it's a completely different type of housing to what existed before in this area. And while this was happening, there were of course, competing visions of what a future city should look like, whether it should completely change the structure of the city with creating more high-rise housing, for example, and more open space areas, or whether it was better to go back to something that replicated the past. Now, alongside these changes and decisions, the other important thing here is that the war didn't only destroy the urban fabric, it also destroyed the ethnic, cultural, religious, and socioeconomic fabric of certain parts of the city. And many communities were completely dissolved, not only because people died, but also because they were rehoused elsewhere, or they became homeless. So it was an opportunity not only to revolutionize and reorganize the urban fabric, but also the society itself. And to a certain extent, tackle some of the pre-war problems. For example, the depressed areas, unemployment, and overcrowding in certain parts of the cities. So we have this competing interests between visions of the city and what it should look like, the urban fabric, as well as changes in the socioeconomic structure of the city, in order to create, as Chancellor Konrad Adenauer emphasized, a more fair society. And the other thing that is important here is that alongside depictions of the urban fabric of the buildings and the distraction, etc., there were also maps collected and created about population changes, as well as other socioeconomic information. So what we see here is that on the left-hand side, there is a map showing for Hamburg, the Hamburg area, the population changes between 39 and 49. In the middle, we have in Nuremberg what the map calls the Jewish topography, or sites of Jewish properties in 48. And on the right-hand side, we have a different way of looking at the bomb damage for Hamburg, for example. So we have a lot of information there depicted on these maps, not only about the buildings, but also related to the socioeconomic structure. And what we also have is what we call the Yearbücher, the annual books that cities have been issuing. We see on the left-hand side the statistical yearbook of 1939 for Nuremberg. And these books contain a lot of population-related information about the population pyramids, the structure, unemployment. It varies by year, but it's an attempt to publish this kind of information. And these yearbooks are very valuable sources, actually, because they were almost uninterrupted apart from the war years. So we can find information pre-war and post-war. And you can see on the right-hand side more contemporary maps from 2017, looking at people living in Nuremberg, population density, and as well as in the middle from 1961. So these maps have associated socio-demographic information in many cases. What do we do with all this information that we collect in order to address these questions about the urban fabric in relation to the socioeconomic structure? Is we use, of course, geographical information systems to capture the spatial information, link it to the socioeconomic and descriptive data, and then be able to map it and do spatial analysis. And you just see examples here of how detailed these maps can be and how much work there is involved. That's why we have gone for a case study approach rather than for covering the whole of Germany, for example. What we can do next is, of course, carry out analysis, such as the one you see in the middle. And also for those who understand a little bit about what geographical information systems can do, you can investigate relationships, distances, evaluate the urban structure, overlay different layers of information. For example, the distraction maps that you see on the left, with unemployment data that you see in the middle, as well as the structure of the city or measurements related to the structure of the city that you see on the right. Now, this is roughly what the project is aiming to do, but to get a better idea of what is happening at the finer scale, I'm going to present you with some of these maps for a specific case study, for one of the case study areas, which is Essen in Germany. And Essen is an industrial city that is now kind of post-industrial, but the city center, you can see in the map from 1938 on the right, more or less represents a typical German city with beautiful cathedrals and the city center and the city house and some sort of 2-3 story buildings arranged in a certain way. Now, on the left, you can see that the structure of the city center hasn't changed dramatically, but the buildings themselves have changed. So what we have today in Essen city center is actually high-rise buildings, not many people living in the city center per se. And in general, we have services and shops. And the overall view of the city is very different. Now, we're not only examining Essen city center, we're looking at Essen as a whole, the whole city, including the suburbs, for our case study. Therefore, we will be able to say something about the socioeconomic changes in the structure. But focusing on the city center and how it went through this kind of transformation, we can see here the repeated bombings, photographs from the archive with repeated bombings of Essen. And you can see how in 1948, at the very top, there were still buildings standing, of course, 43, very few of them. And by 1944, there was almost a complete destruction of the city center, as you can also see in the aerial photograph on the left. And the reason was, first of all, there was the industrial heartland. The whole area in the Ruhr area was the industrial heartland of Germany during those years, but also because the Krupp factory and producing ammunition was strongly linked to Essen, and the Allied forces were trying to destroy. The map on the right that shows destruction is a little bit misleading because the totally destroyed buildings are the ones where you only see the outline, and the black buildings are the only ones standing. And this is clearly shown in the photo at the bottom from 1944. And here we have different representations of Essen in relation to this bombing and how these plans changed or were shown in different levels of detail and different colors, for example. But you can see on the right-hand side where we see the whole of the city, again, that the minimum destruction of buildings was in the very suburbs, while most of the city center and the surrounding areas of the city center were destroyed for anything from 6 to 100% in red, and 10 to 60%, which is a little bit difficult to assess because it varies from very little destruction to almost half the building being destroyed in blue. But the overall color is quite red in this area in the city center. And then we have here reconstruction, well, first of all, measurement of destruction and then suggestions for reconstruction plans in the city center. And I will show you some of these. So the other important information here is that these destruction maps of the bombed areas come with evaluations of what sort of spaces were destroyed and how they were proposed to be rebuilt. And this is what you see here on the right-hand side infographic. So you have different types of areas and the amount of destruction here with different colors and how they were being rebuilt up to 1949 or what the plans were anyway. And of course, the other thing we have is comparative maps showing the situation before the bombings and after. And you can see very clearly here how many buildings there are on the upper plan and how many of them have been destroyed. As I said, the empty just the outlines are the destroyed buildings, and the black are the ones still standing. The other interesting thing that we found in the archive is descriptions of typical housing. And we can see here on the left-hand side, typical housing in Essen up to 1900. So you can see here 2 3-story houses and buildings. And then, and here is the interesting thing that maybe reflect very heavily, because these are historical documents and they are depicting housing up to the war. And here the war is, the archivist has entered the First World War, because the post-war period of housing, of course, is referring to the First World War. And this is why the archivist has put a note there indicating that it's from 1920 to 1926. Now, we couldn't find similar plans and descriptors for the post-war years for comparison, but you can see how the housing has changed during the pre-war years. Post-war, however, or during the war and post-war, what we have is very detailed plans showing those visions of the city that I was talking about earlier. So we have an area here, a relatively small area, that shows in black in the middle how the housing was laid out. And this needs to be related to the previous images I showed you about the different types of housing. So you can probably guess from the way the housing is laid out that these are relatively low houses with gardens, etc. So they have a specific socioeconomic kind of connotation. And then you can see the proposals in the plan on the left-hand side in black that will replace this low height housing that was destroyed. And the question then is how much of this was destroyed? And this is one of the questions we're asking. How many of these houses were knocked down because they were destroyed, and how many were knocked down to make way for this new vision of high-rise buildings that you see on the left. And on the right-hand side, you can see the reality as it kind of materialized in red, which is blocks of flats, basically 5 or 6 stories high, and with some green space around them, but or empty space for that matter, but complete change of the structure of this neighborhood, and by extension, a complete change of the socioeconomic structure as well. So I'm wrapping up very slowly here, and what we have here on the left again is one of these Essen-wide distraction maps covering the whole of the city. And again, it's a little bit misleading because the yellow, the hashed area, is the buildings or areas destroyed between 50 and 100%. And you can see here as well the Krupp association, the areas related to the Krupp factory. And the black are the buildings and areas destroyed between anything between 0 and 50%. On the right-hand side, what you have is the new vision, the reconstruction of Essen around 1949, and the different land uses that were being promoted and designed. So you have some of the areas still standing and remaining, but the change that happened in this heavily bombed area is what we are really interested in investigating in terms of how this kind of transition in the urban planning affected the socioeconomic fabric of the city. So just to conclude, this is the sub-project of this urban meta mapping consortium, and the other projects are looking at more at maps as instruments of communication, while the GESIS sub-project is making this link between the changes in urban planning and the socioeconomic structure of the cities. It's a 4-year project. This is why I only presented the concept here. We're only about 4 months into the project. There's a long way to go. There's many archives to visit. Unfortunately, the whole thing has been delayed. I only managed to visit the Essen archive a couple of days ago, and that was the first one. We started with And yes, hopefully I will be able to present some results next time I give a talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Catherine's put a comment in the chat. Do you want to elaborate that a bit more about symbology?
Yeah, I can. Oh, sorry, I don't know if you wanted me to elaborate.
Yeah.
It started off as a comment, but then it ended up being a question at the end. But basically, I was really interested in the choice of symbology on the map showing the destruction, where you basically got the empty spaces showing empty spaces in reality. So it makes sense, but maybe doesn't make sense for the way that we view maps today. So maybe our understandings of these like kind of standard mapping conventions have changed quite significantly.
Yeah, this is. I mean, this is what triggered the whole project. It was around how different things are depicted on maps and what sort of message this communicates. To what extent? I mean, there will be people in this larger group looking at this exact point, but we are more interested in capturing this information somehow through the GIS and showing the change over time. But I take the point that what open space is, how it's depicted on a map, how the different shades are shown, etc., are very good cartographical questions as well.
Debs, do you want to read out your question from the chat as well?
Yeah, sure. Apologies. I think my internet connection is horrible, and I may well have missed you saying that this is really in the very early stages of development as a project. But I was very interested in, well, I suppose what will only be at this point hunches about the kind of covert agendas or overt agendas that were concealed through this graphic depiction of destruction. So I suppose one question is whether you have any hunches as to what agendas you'll see or be able to prove were being pursued. But I was also curious as to whether the maps make a graphic distinction between reconstruction, for example, with sort of historic sites that they want to put back together, and renewal, which is kind of much more explicitly transformative projects. Can you see that distinction?
So on the first question, we have some evidence by looking at the maps and the certain areas that were depicted and labeled on some of these maps. For example, Jewish areas or cemeteries, and how they then kind of disappeared from the face of the city subsequently, or areas that were recorded in various documents, not necessarily explicitly on the maps as slum areas or areas for that needed to be looked at before the war, and then how these areas were gradually, year after year, or during a short period within 2 years, were depicted in the maps. So there's some evidence there that we haven't looked at in great depth, but this is in relation to Nuremberg, for example, and the publication is currently under review, so I cannot share it, but it goes into greater depth into this. The second question was in relation to, can you repeat this, reconstruction or?
Reconstruction or renewal. The first one depicting a more conservative kind of material project. The second gives far greater latitude for complete transformation.
Yeah, this is really less clear on by looking simply at the maps. Yeah, unless we are talking about very specific case study areas and we drill down in depth, like the area I showed you earlier, the messages are not so explicit and explicitly derived from the maps. But what is interesting that we can look at the maps is the way that you saw it in the maps I showed you, the different legends being used. So in some cases, it's up to 10%, in other cases, it's up to 20%. And although there were guidelines about what is considered a destroyed building or a semi-destroyed building, the way they were then grouped in the maps, it kind of kept changing for a few years. So there's this kind of, I would say, a little bit of conflict between explicit guidelines on the one hand down to the micro scale, and then when the data is presented in these larger maps where they talk about huge areas, how then the the shading used and the legends group specific areas together beyond the building. One thing that I mentioned, I forgot to mention, but is related, is what happens with very important buildings. For example, some of the churches or that needed to be preserved under any circumstances because they were kind of the symbols of the city. And they have a different treatment, obviously. In some cases, they reconstructed them stone by stone, completely from scratch, of course, as we know also with Dresden. So there is also this additional conflict between how certain buildings are classified.
Thank you. I have a question. Actually, I can't see any of their hands up, so I'll dive in. Do you think GIS and the accessibility of it has changed the way that we engage with the old maps and how urban planning works?
Yeah, so I mean, at a very simple level, we can, of course, scan, georeference, and then overlay these maps and look at them visually. But what we are hoping that is gonna happen here, the insight that using a tool like GIS is going to give us is this extra layer of information where we can not only overlay the scanned maps with additional socioeconomic data, but also digitize part of these maps and do further analysis. To what extent this will then influence urban planning, etc., I think well, this remains to be seen. I mean, GIS is used as a tool, but the other message here is that sometimes it's not the tools, it's the tools are simply being used as a justification for certain decisions that need to be taken at different levels.
Thank you. And unless anyone else wants to dive in with another question before we move on, the next speaker is Ketaki Savnal, and she's presenting a paper called #LoveMumbai, Selfie Points and the Disciplining of Everyday Neighbourhood Photography. She's a documentary filmmaker and has worked on films about urban culture, poetry and music in India. She's currently a PhD student at the University of East Anglia, examining networked camera practices and public art in Mumbai. So if you want to share your screen.
Thanks, Charlotte. Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, I can see that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really enjoying listening to everyone who's presented so far. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to participate in this workshop. Today, I'm talking about selfie points in Mumbai. I'll explain what that means in a bit, but this is also part of the research that I'm doing for my PhD, in which I'm looking at networked camera phone photography, selfie cultures, and the implication on the experience of material space in the city of Mumbai. I'm still in the initial stages of collecting and analyzing data. So if anyone has any suggestions or feedback at the end of the presentation, I'd be really glad to take some notes. Right, so I'll get started. In this presentation, I'm talking specifically about public installations that are demarcated as selfie points with a signboard at the location, or a typographic installation in a public place that uses the word love or includes a hashtag symbol which references social media, or an installation that's been identified as a selfie point in the media. I approach these installations as prompts intended to generate affect and behaviors that produce disciplined digital data. And I argue that they perpetuate historic caste and class-based segregation of the physical and the digital city. The selfie point trend started in 2016 when the Shiv Sena, a nativist political party headquartered in Mumbai, adopted an installation from the Kalagoda Arts Festival, a contemporary street art festival, and placed it at a permanent location in Mumbai. The installation was created by artist Hitesh Malviya from the Start India Foundation and is reminiscent of city branding exercises carried out in New York, Amsterdam, and Toronto. The installation spells out Love Mumbai, as you can see, The word love is in the Devanagari script and red in color, while Mumbai is in the white. And in the Roman script, the two terminals of the letter L in Devanagari are joined together to create a heart shape, symbolically repeating the love spelled out by the Devanagari letters. At the end of the festival, the Start India Foundation started an online petition to exhibit the installation permanently in the city. Aditya Thackeray, who was then the leader of the Yuva Sena, the youth wing of the Shiv Sena, took over the cause and announced through his social media page that the installation would have a permanent home at the Bandra Reclamation Promenade against the backdrop of the Arabian Sea and the city's skyline. Now, one could see this as just a city branding exercise, but the next year there was a turf war over a selfie point at Shivaji Park, and it made me think of selfie points in terms of political visibility and the appropriation of space. At Shivaji Park, an open ground in central Mumbai, 3 Hindutva political parties, which are sort of right-wing Hindu political parties, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the Shiv Sena, and the Maharashtra Navnirman Sena, which is an offshoot of the Shiv Sena, fought for control over a small part of the park, which the MNS had successfully converted into a selfie point. The selfie point consisted of a canopy over a short stretch of the jogging track encircling the park, with colorful objects dangling from it, which changed with the seasons. A poster nearby identified it as a selfie point and invited people to take selfies with it. On 1st March 2017, soon after the MNS's defeat in the G North Ward, which is where this park lies, they announced that it was difficult to raise the annual 12 lakhs, which is approximately 12,000 pounds, required for the upkeep of the selfie point. Soon after this, the Shiv Sena and the BJP said that they would take over the selfie point, and then the MNS announced that it would find a way to continue to fund it. On 3rd March, the BMC granted all 3 political parties space to construct selfie points 50 meters from each other, and this story was widely reported in the media as a major battle amongst the political parties. Eventually, the original MNS selfie point was taken down, and the other 2 political parties lost interest in it, but continued to build selfie points elsewhere at a rapid pace. In January 2020, I mapped over 25 selfie points at various places in the city. Most of them are located in residential neighborhoods, not near tourist attractions, and resemble the Love Mumbai installation at Bandra Reclamation, but have replaced the word Mumbai with the locality that they are situated in. Some of them have changed the red and white color scheme or added other elements that represent local communities, but largely the selfie points follow the same style. I see this proliferation of selfie points as an indication of the growing importance of the digital in the making and the remaking of the material city and city-based identities. To locate these selfie points, I use trial and error on Google Maps, typing the name of each location preceded by love or followed by selfie point. Most of the selfie points had been added as locations on Google Maps, and many were even classified as recreational spaces and had been rated and reviewed by other users. Towards the end of my hunt, with just a few days to find the selfie points dotted all over the city, I turned to Instagram stories and the Ask a Question sticker to ask friends about where they'd last seen one. This was for me the quickest way to crowdsource the data, but also a method to get a sense of the ways in which the selfie point was experienced and remembered, and opinions that my friends and followers had about them. At each selfie point, I took photographs and made notes about iconographic elements, and took selfies at each selfie point to understand the physical experience. Through the documentation process, I also continued to update my Instagram stories, inviting responses to selfies at various points. The most interesting result of this exercise was what I could glean from the way in which people told me about the location of the selfie point that they had noticed. In one instance, a friend wrote, "There's one in the park at Chaitya Bhumi." Chaitya Bhumi is an important Ambedkarite landmark and pilgrimage site where Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, who drafted the Indian Constitution and inspired the Dalit Buddhist movement, was cremated. Spatially, it is located next to Shivaji Park, as you can see on the map on the left, and it's divided by a road which I've indicated in red. Chaitya Bhumi is next to the beach, overlooking the Arabian Sea, while Shivaji Park is inland and closer to the Shiv Sena headquarters. When I reached the garden at Chaitya Bhumi, I realized that the selfie point actually reads Shivaji Park Point. The word Shivaji is painted in saffron flames, invoking the valor of the Maratha chieftain, while the word park is painted with green and blue, mirroring the grass and the sky, and point is in white. But the selfie point is located not inside Shivaji Park, but in the garden next to Chaitya Bhumi, reinscribing the Dalit site as a Maratha site and reinforcing the hegemonic upper caste culture of the locality. Following Kajri Jain, I also pay attention to the fabric of the installations in terms of caste privilege. The very textures, colors, and lights that are desirable in urban digital photography. Bright colors and shiny acrylic sheets that can be lit from inside with LED lighting are vulnerable to the physical elements of dust, heat, and bird droppings. According to Jain, Dalit statues are made of strong fabrics such as marble and stone to make it difficult for the next Savarna government to destroy. These selfie points, in their upper caste hegemonic ideals that they espouse, can be built in the social media aesthetic with easily destructible materials without the anxiety of vandalism or destruction. The selfie point at Malad, which reads Love Malad and Jai Maharashtra with a map of Maharashtra, also has a separate board with the face of a local corporator. In the age of photo editing software, it seems almost counterintuitive and archaic to build a physical photo booth in public space when real estate is valuable and the installation competes with advertising billboards and suffers weather and dust of the city. The only way to make sense of it then is to see the selfie points as a new iteration of political hoardings in which lesser-known politicians routinely display large posters to announce and celebrate even trivial matters, such as the birthday of political leaders, in order to publicize themselves and place themselves and their faces within the party lineup. In the last decade, there have been several court interventions to ban these posters. I see the selfie point as a contemporary rendition of the political poster, which appears to be beautifying the city while allowing local politicians to have permanent advertising. The images can also be circulated on social media, extending the life and the reach of the physical installation and the face of the politician. At the Malad selfie point, MNS corporator Deepak Pawar's supporters and citizens are invited to perform an act of obeisance by taking a selfie with his face. Pawar's nativist political ideology is contained in the map of Maharashtra that sits at the foot of the Love Malad sign. I also see selfie points as disciplinary forces that, from a Foucauldian lens, produce and subjectify the selfie taker. These selfie points tell the individual not just where to take their selfies, but also how to make the recreational activity productive by imbuing the images with patriotism. In the eastern suburb of Powai, the member of Legislative Assembly, Mohammad Arif Naseem Khan, member of the Indian National Congress, has built a selfie point near the Powai Lake. His name and face feature prominently at the top of the installation. In a video interview to a news channel, Khan's representative says, "There are many selfie points in Mumbai. There's one for Chembur, one for Mankhurd, there's an I Love Ghatkopar, but love for the country comes first, and that is why we have named this I Love India and made it in the colors of the Indian flag." The representative's comments might be seen as a case of petty one-upmanship common in the political arena, but in the current situation where Muslims are being discriminated against, this proclamation of nationalism could also arise from a sense of religious anxiety and a need to prove allegiance to the nation. When I took a selfie at the Love My India selfie point at Powai, even though I tried different camera angles, I was unable to include the abandoned playground next to the installation or the road that had been dug up in front of it, which you can see on the right. It was impossible for me to visually represent within the image any sentiment other than those expressed by the words on the installation, even though through the field of vision of my eye, I could see the glaring differences between the new selfie point and its surroundings. It was only when I climbed up to a footover bridge nearby that I was able to capture the image on the right. In this kind of strategic placement of selfie points along busy roads and against sea face or garden backgrounds, interventions in physical space attempt to tame visual representations of the city on social networking sites. In another different reappropriation of space, The I Love Lokhandwala selfie point is located at the edge of the upscale Lokhandwala complex, closer to Jogeshwari, a lower class Muslim locality. The installation uses the same white and red color scheme and is built by a private builder along the wall of a newly built skyscraper over an open sewer, probably to increase the value of the property. This selfie point follows in a string of rebranding exercises, this time led by the real estate industry, in a bid to raise the commercial value of property in working class localities. In the last few years, the number of people taking and uploading selfies at these locality-specific selfie points like Lokhandwala have significantly reduced, although selfie points continue to be built across the city. One way of understanding this might be to think of it in terms of a trend that has passed. Social media trends are transient and evolving, yet these selfie points are permanent freeze frames of an aesthetic that was popular 3 years ago. Another reason might be that the proliferation of the aesthetic has reduced it to a thing of ridicule. As in the case of the Lokhandwala selfie point, some of these installations, in their dilapidated settings, also seem to be mocking the state of disrepair of the city. The only two installations that still seem to be frequented in Bandra and Juhu, the first image that I shared, are visited by tourists and young immigrants who've come to the city for work. For them, an image from a selfie point is an inexpensive souvenir that can instantly be sent to friends and family over WhatsApp. In conclusion, while I focused on selfie points as a disciplinary mechanism to be resisted, the variety in the images aggregated on Instagram demonstrates the rhizomatic nature of the web and the affordances for different and conflicting formulations, interpretations, and even possibilities for resistance. While I work through other ways of thinking about these images, I remind myself of the spontaneity and the fun that underscore the selfie, and the collapse and distinctions of physical and digital space, the photographer and the photographed, and the mediation of corporations, governments, authority figures, and artistic groups. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. We've got a few questions in the chat. Deb, do you want to start us off with your question?
Yeah, hi, this is probably the least interesting question, but I was struck, having been a student at Deccan College in the 90s, when the Shiv Sena aggressively took over what was called the Classical Workers Union. It was conspicuous that the sign would go up next to the institution. It happened in lots of educational institutions. And I suppose the similarity was with the Ambedkar Park, where there was a kind of marking out space, even on the basis of quite a slight claim to it. It was a conspicuous way of inserting a symbol associated with the Shiv Sena.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the Shiv Sena seems to really be good at doing that, right? I mean, that's in their history. So I've been reading about the political party, and I feel like a lot of this, the impetus for these selfie points comes from the Shiv Sena, and they're doing it really interestingly. So there's a selfie point right outside a very big Catholic church, and it's a tiger that's pouncing, right? And it's right outside the church, and I sort of interpret it as this sort of Hindu aggression towards that sort of marginalized community. And I've seen this happen in several places. The difficulty is sort of trying to pin that down because there's no real evidence, because it's just a tiger, right? But that is the symbol of the Shiv Sena also. So I mean, they seem to be really good at doing this. Yeah.
Yeah, this is clearly a strategy that they employ, and yeah, I've never seen it outside of Bombay and Mumbai and Pune. It's not there in Delhi at all.
Yeah.
Hello, sorry, I think my Wi-Fi dropped out for a second there. Is Deb's question finished?
Yeah.
Okay, Rihanna, do you want to ask yours?
Yeah, of course. So I was just going to ask, do you think that the positioning of the selfie point in the garden near where Dr. Ambedkar was cremated was a deliberate act? And if so, does that suggest an attempt to antagonise both Dalit communities and Muslims?
Thanks. Yeah. That's sort of part of the next part of my fieldwork, where I think I need to have conversations with the commissioning politicians, but I don't think it's seen as an overt act of aggression. I see it as that, but I don't think, because that entire area is known as Shivaji Park, and at the same time, I think so every year we have Ambedkarites come to Shivaji Park to mark the day, to mark Mahaparinirvan Divas, and it's interesting, right? Because I think if you pay attention to the names and you pay attention to these spaces and what they mean, that's when you see it as a form of aggression. But I really think, I think that's something I might be able to answer in maybe a few months once I've done a little more fieldwork and gotten a sense of how people in the area feel about it. But people are also very hesitant to talk about how they feel, especially because the Shiv Sena scene is very aggressive. And they've also been changing their strategy. Like, they've actually become sort of a center political party now, because they are building themselves in opposition to the BJP, because they've had a fallout with the BJP. So there's also that sort of additional politics happening right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've had another question from Shanmuga Priya, if you want to read that out from the chat.
Yeah, hello. I just asked whether you have looked at the social media of the political parties who actually built the selfie point to comprehend how they use this kind of strategy to promote their parties, and the kind of response to that from the audience in the comment section. Or do you have any plan, or have you already looked at?
So I think one thing is that each of the selfie points is built by a different authority figure. So some of them are built by builders, some of them are built by political parties or MLAs, local MLAs in that area. Some are commissioned. Some of them very clearly have the names of the people who've commissioned them. Others don't. Some of them were made by the artist, the original artist who made that installation. And I think that he's building them in other parts of the country as well. So that's sort of an independent sort of artistic movement happening in the city. So, I mean, there's sort of, each one is different. And could you repeat the second part of the question, please?
No, I'm just asking how the political parties use this strategy to promote their parties through social media, because they might posting in their particular social media, they might post about this selfie, because in the first few slides you mentioned that Shiv Sena they took photo with they took selfie in front of that some of the artistic selfie points. So whether they are using it to promote their party among the youth, because in India we have two sets of youth, that one supports politics, one supports entirely head the politics in India. So how do see the response from the audience for those kind of social media posts?
I think in 2016, it seemed like the political parties were doing it to create sort of response on social media. But increasingly, I feel like these selfie points aren't being used as much anymore for several reasons. I think one of them might be the pandemic, but they continue to be built, right? Like, even right now, there have been a few new selfie points built. So I'm not sure if the point is to create social media sort of momentum as much as it is to take over physical space, right? Because they always built along roads or in prominent places where you can see them while you're traveling through the city, even though they're in specific localities. So it seems more of a case of them trying to appropriate physical space than create a dialogue on social media, although that does happen too, but that seems like a sort of secondary benefit to building these selfie points.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Ben, if you'd like to ask your question from the chat.
Hi, Ketaki. Yeah, so the first talk about street art and augmented reality got me thinking. I imagine you couldn't always kind of protest or vandalize these things in physical form without getting in a lot of trouble. But could you take a selfie and then kind of digitally vandalize your own photo and put that on social media? Does that happen?
That's a great idea. No, it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. But it's giving me ideas. I've not noticed it. I haven't noticed it on social media, but yeah, I'm surprised though. Now that you've mentioned it, I'm surprised nobody's done it yet.
I was just thinking whether kind of policing extends into the digital world as well as the physical. Would that still get noticed?
I mean, now there's been a lot of policing, or there's been talk of policing social media, and the government wants to create like these sort of little groups of people who sort of tell on each other, and you'd get trolled if you did it, but I don't know if there'd be any actual sort of political, any legal sort of ramifications of doing it. But I think there have been articles, people have written sort of long form articles critiquing these installations, sort of making fun of them. There has been commentary, but I don't think there's been any visual engagement with it as an image yet.
Okay, thanks very much. That was great.
Thank you.
We also have a question from Akash, if you'd like to read that out.
Yeah, so the question that I have is, are there selfie points which have come up on their own as a result of local initiatives without any political patronage of sort? And in that sense, how do they differ from, those selfie points which are sort of corporate funded, and how does it work out?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something I didn't get into in this presentation, but it began, there was sort of a selfie point boom in 2015, where people started going to sort of, there are sort of abandoned forts in Mumbai where there's no sort of police patrolling, and they started going to the sea face and taking selfies at just sort of scenic parts of the city. And there were a lot of accidents. There were some like widely reported selfie deaths that happened. And the police then marked 16 places in the city where selfies were banned. And at that point, selfie sticks were really popular. So they banned the use of selfie sticks. They banned the use of any kind of photography in these places. They started having police presence in these places. And these were just sort of scenic parts of the city, right? And I think the first few selfie points that were built were an effort on the part of the local government to create sort of safe spaces for people to take photographs. And those were, so there's one section outside the CST station, what used to be the Victoria Terminus, which is this Gothic building, and which is really beautifully lit up now. And people would go there to take selfies, and they create sort of traffic jams on the main road. So the BMC built a little viewing gallery on the other side of the road so that people could take photographs safely from there. So there have been these sorts of organic selfie points that develop, but they don't have, none of them are installations like these are. There's just sort of people taking photos at scenic parts of the city. Does that answer?
Thank you.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
We've got 5 minutes left, but we've also got a question from Sudeshta, if you'd like to read that out before we finish.
Hi, sorry for trouble, and thank you, Ketaki, for the talk. I just wondered one thing which came into my head. In Rome, I had seen these kind of installations with love. So I just wondered whether, is there a little history of these installations which has come up suddenly in India in 2016, and I'm talking about seeing these in Rome in 2015. I haven't seen anywhere else, but that is just to think about what happens outside.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it began in Amsterdam. The first one was in Amsterdam, and the Amsterdam one seems to have copied the color from the New York branding of the 60s. So there's definitely a trend of city branding exercises, and the New York one has been criticized by locals. Not the New York one, sorry. The one in Amsterdam is seen very unfavorably by people, and so obviously, like, this is, I mean, you can sort of trace it back to the 60s New York.
But I just meant, just this love, exactly the way it is. You see it in Bombay. I still call it Bombay. I'm sorry.
No, I do.
College, but it is exactly the way. And I just saw it today in Cambridge, where I am. They had these cows. In Chicago, they had cows, and they have got back cows here. So when you think in terms of installations and selfie points which develop, I mean, yes, there is politics, of course, in many of these things, but there are other factors also happening. So that's what I just wanted to bring up to you.
Yeah. No, that's great. I found an article, an interview of the artist, and I've been meaning to meet him. He's a typographic artist who works in, I think in, he teaches at a university in India somewhere. He teaches typography there, and he's sort of taken inspiration from those installations. He's very clearly said that they exist in other cities, and we wanted to make a version of it for India. So I think it might have just begun with his personal sort of inspiration, and then it was copied by everybody in this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think we have any more questions. I can't see any hands up, so if anyone wants to ask one before we finish, now's your chance. Oh, is that Ben with your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, I just thought of something. So although I am slightly taking the piss out of this in the chat, on a serious note, are these kind of political monuments almost, are they engaging the population more with politics? I thought if you had these things spread around the UK, people would actually care more about politics.
Could you say that again? I don't.
Yes. So I'm just wondering whether if one of these appears in your local community, is there a sense that local community then becomes more engaged in wider political debates because suddenly it's in their face?
Yeah, I don't think so.
No.
I mean, I don't know that. I think, again, like, it's difficult to generalize because I think some communities will, there's one in Dharavi, which is commonly reported in the media as the largest slum or the second largest slum in Asia. And that says, I love Dharavi. And in a place like that, maybe there might be sort of, the youth might feel like a sense of ownership of that space. But in a lot of other places, it feels like it's just lip service. So it's a bit difficult to generalize because Mumbai is also a city which is just so sort of diverse and very ghettoized. So each locality has a different sort of class, religious, caste sort of history. So it's a bit hard to say.
No, that's great. Thanks. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that's all the questions. So ready to wrap up. Deb, do you want to say anything before we finish?
Oh gosh, I mustn't take us past like 4 o'clock. I love a prompt finish time. So just to say thank you, everyone. It's been absolutely brilliant. It's been a great pleasure. And I hope people manage to stay in touch with each other. Thank you. And thank you to our fantastic chairs. Oh, and thank you, of course, to Catherine and Rihanna for being absolutely brilliant as ever.
Brilliant.
Bye.
See you later.